Joining me right now to discuss, retired Marine intelligence officer, host of the Strat podcast, Hal Kempfer. Thank you so much, Hal, for being here. A major victory to have these 3 hostages released alive this weekend in spite of Hamas's initial threat that was going to call the whole weekend off. In regards to phase 2 of negotiations, Prime Minister Netanyahu says he will convene a meeting tomorrow with his cabinet. What is your prediction for what happens in that meeting and what happens next?
Adrienne, I think it's going to be a very tough 2 weeks until they get to that around March 1st deadline when phase 2 is supposed to begin. Right now, of course, as you mentioned, Hamas said they weren't going to release the hostages. President Trump came out, made a very strong comment, which basically said a noon deadline for Saturday, said release them and release all of them, and gave a green light to Israel to do whatever they're going to do. Basically saying if you want to go militarily, we fully back you. No daylight between the U.S. and the Israeli position. What that does is it sets up a very strong negotiating position for Israel across the board, and it puts a message out there to Hamas that they have got to negotiate in earnest. The challenge Hamas has is that they're basically negotiating in many ways the end of Hamas. They won't be a governing entity in Gaza. They won't be part of the reconstruction. Even the Egyptians have made that clear. They won't be part of the reconstruction, and they won't be a military threat. So Hamas has to have some overwhelming sort of Damocles, if you will, hanging over them. And I think that's kind of what you're seeing set up today with the discussions, and certainly what President Trump just said.
The secretary also expected to push President Trump's plan for America to take over Gaza. Does he have any leverage as far as selling this audacious idea?
The leverage is basically bringing it up. Of course, the U.S. has tremendous presence and power throughout the Middle East. And during my career, I've spent time in a number of those countries. We have quite a military presence throughout the Middle East, and influence going back. We have very close relationships with a number of countries. So yes, he does have some leverage. But the other thing that's going on at the same time is Egypt is taking the lead and forming up the Arab alternative plan, if you will. And that's something that's been languishing for quite some time. In fact, part of this negotiation strategy, throwing out this is a way of forcing the Arab states, Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and others, to come up with an alternative plan, which they have not wanted to do because it puts them on record behind a plan. Well, they're coming up with a plan. So the more he says this, the more it puts a lot of pressure on the Egyptians to really take lead in that and come up with something. And they have to do it before the 27th. They have to do it by the end of the month, because that's when they're having a Cairo summit to discuss what this plan is going to be. So the pressure's on them as well.
There's more pressure in Saudi Arabia with these high-level talks between Secretary of State Rubio and Russian officials about ending the war in Ukraine. I thought it's very interesting. Ukraine's not invited to be a part of these talks. You have Zelensky speaking in Munich, kind of walking this tightrope of sorts about not relying on the U.S. as much in terms of Europe's independence, and yet thanking America for their partnership. Is this a game of chess?
It's a game of multi-dimensional chess is what's going on right now. It's fascinating what's happening. There actually is nothing wrong with foreign ministers, the Secretary of State meeting his counterpart in a third country like Saudi Arabia. There's nothing wrong with that, not having the Ukrainians at the table. Of course, the optics are what they are. Coming out of the Munich Security Conference and everything that's happened this last week, everybody's on edge with the comments by Vice President Vance, Secretary of Defense Hegseth. Everybody is a little bit nervous that the U.S. is going on some sort of unilateral mission to negotiate something with Russia direct and leave the Europeans and the Ukrainians on the sidelines while they figure it out. Sounds like 19th century great colonial politics, if you will. But there's nothing wrong with getting the discussion. And frankly, the Ukrainians being at that table in Saudi Arabia could hinder some of the level of directness between the U.S. and Russia on this. And there may be things we want to communicate very directly, which may show that there isn't a lot of daylight between the Ukrainian position and our position. I don't think we're going to say that publicly. I don't think we want to signal exactly where we are, but that's one of the issues.
It's going to be very fascinating to see how all of these egos deal with the change coming. Thanks so much for watching. Go to joinnn.com to find News Nation on your television provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of News Nation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.